Yeah, so last 2 weeks ago was a very, very major milestone for us. We formed Canada Nickel back in 2019 with the Crawford nickel deposit. There was 4 drill holes in it at that point in time. We started the company, raised $6.5 million privately with the 5th drill hole, 300 drill holes plus later, 300 met tests later, several thousand metallurgical samples, and we were able to put our feasibility study a couple weeks ago. What's even more exciting to us is we think, we're unlocking an entire new nickel district. That Crawford is just the first of what will be multiple big ultramafic nickel deposits, and most of us on the team have other targets within our portfolio that is actually we think are going to be better than Crawford, but we're very excited about how well Crawford ended up landing. Before I get into some of the specifics there, I will talk about the nickel market. I've been covering the nickel market since I took over as head of commodity research at Inco back in 2001. There's a lot of similarities right now between what analysts are saying about the nickel market today and what they're missing. And we saw the same thing back in the early 2000s when people really didn't understand just how big an impact China was going to have on the nickel market. And we think the same thing's true with the electric vehicle market, which would be very exciting times for both Sudbury and our new nickel district. I will say lots of forward-looking things. They may or may not be true. You guys can judge from here. Basically, one of the big challenges with the nickel market is more than 100% of the supply since 2016 has all come from Indonesia. Most of that supply is basically comes from melting laterite ore, which is effectively soggy dirt with 1% nickel in it, and uses a massive amount of energy and coal to get there. So you're looking at 50 to 80 tons of CO2 per ton of nickel produced. We haven't really found many new nickel deposits, and I'll go into that into some detail. And so, we really do need a large scale, low carbon source of nickel. And we think what we're unlocking here in the Timmins Nickel District, we really will be that next generation of nickel supply. Nickel has always been a high growth metal for the last 50 or 60 years. Stainless steel is the primary use, and it's grown at 5 to 6% a year for more than 50 years. We don't expect that to slow down anytime soon. And what's exciting is that, again, over the last 3 or 4 years now, we've got this new source of demand from electric vehicle batteries. And again, nickel is the element in the battery that provides the long energy density, which is what in turn provides the long range. And so, people are continuing to find ways to jam more nickel into those batteries in order to maximize the range for where range is important in those batteries. What we've seen already this decade is, since 2000, nickel demand has grown by we'll end up by the end of this year, up 9 to 10% per year since 2020. I can assure you that there are very few analysts, if any, who had demand forecasts anywhere near that level. And so some pretty interesting things happen when you start to extrapolate that over the next while. And again, remember, we are just getting into the point in time on the EV cycle where we're really starting to see real sizable demand growth from North America. And that's the market where people drive big trucks and cars. It's not China, it's not Europe, where you have little cars that lithium iron phosphate batteries are totally fine. We're really just getting into the nickel intensive phase of the EV demand growth. And again, like we saw in the early 2000s, analysts, continued to underestimate what that demand growth looks like. In terms of, being able to step up and meet that demand, like the early 2000s, the nickel industry, really didn't have a lot of projects. They had a lot of projects on the shelf, but very few projects ready to go when China showed up. And so Chinese invented nickel pig iron at that time. And, today, we're in a similar position where there's actually we're in a worse position. There's almost nothing in the project pipeline outside of Indonesia. And we are going to need something that's A, not Chinese controlled, B, not with a high carbon footprint, and somewhere in North America and Europe to serve the big increase in demand growth since that time. In terms of discoveries, the last million-ton high grade, and I qualify high grade as greater than 1% nickel, was Voisey's Bay in 1992. Anglo-Sakatti deposit, their unpublished number is higher than that. So we've had two in basically 30 plus years since that time. And most of the world's laterites have been known for more than 40 plus years. So we don't have any real new nickel laterite discoveries during that time frame. Where we ended up with Crawford, very, very happy that where we ended up landing. Again, the big benefit of these big ultramafics not only is the scale and the fact they're scalable in terms of a big open pit operation, is the fact that they're hosted in ultramafic rock, which when exposed to air spontaneously absorbs CO2. And so, not only can we be a large source of nickel, we can be a zero carbon source of nickel. In terms of some of the key metrics, we're the world's second largest nickel reserve today. We're the world's second largest nickel resource. In terms of discoveries, other than Norilsk and Sudbury, this is the largest nickel sulfide discovery during that time frame. The big benefit is with our what we call our IPT, in-process tailings carbonation process. We're able to store over 1.5 million tons of CO2 annually, which results in a net carbon footprint of a negative 30 tons of CO2 produced. We also produce a nickel chrome magnetite product, which is ideal for the stainless and alloy steel market. If we were in production today, we would be the only North American source of chromium and supplying about 15% of the market. Chromium is a critical mineral in both the United States and Canada, and will produce well more than 1 million tons of iron annually. Again, what's exciting about Crawford and why we're really talking about the Timmins Nickel District now, because the geophysics with these type of deposits gives you a significant part of the answer in terms of what you're looking for. We were able to acquire 20 plus targets with a footprint that's 24 times the footprint of Crawford. And just in terms of total resource, we've got just under 10 million tons across all categories and just under 4 million tons in terms of nickel reserve. So, if you multiply that math, you end up with a very, very large amount of nickel. In terms of the nickel market, this is a forecast that we've had since 2019. At that time, we were quite a way ahead of most analysts. Today, they've largely caught up and are in this range. And again, it's just nickel growing at the low end of its traditional use, plus some significant amount of growth from the battery market. If you extrapolate the current rate of 9 to 10%, which we've seen since 2020, you're looking at total demand of over 6 million tons. Where we were before, you needed a doubling in total supply. And yes, Indonesia is going to supply 2 million tons plus. But the real issue is where's the visibility on the rest of this supply going to come from? In terms of where that supplies come from, again, anything that is saprolite that's being reduced pyrometallurgically, except for Vale's operations in central Sulawesi that have access to hydroelectricity, they all come with a massive carbon footprint. HPAL is significantly lower, but still a significant amount of carbon. And the types of sulfide deposits, which we have in Sudbury and Timmins, are much lower carbon footprint to start with. And these numbers don't include the net benefit of the ultramafic waste rock and tailings ability to soak up CO2. The other major issue in nickel supply is the supply concentration. OPEC at its peak in 1973 controlled over half of the market for oil. We all know what they did over the subsequent few years. We're in the position now where Indonesia, just on its own, is almost has as much share as OPEC did at its peak. If you add in a couple other countries like the Philippines and Russia, you can very quickly get to a very large amount of the nickel market. And Indonesia on its own within a few years will be more than 2/3 of the nickel market. If you think this is a crazy crockpot idea in terms of, an ONEC in our future, the current mines minister of Indonesia is running around the world right now, trying to assemble, this kind of cartel. It's coming. You will see Indonesia. We had a little sneak preview of it a few months ago. You will see them manage nickel supply in terms of mining quotas. They very much want to maximize the revenue that they're going to get from this finite nickel resource. And they've taken a bunch of extraordinary steps so far in terms of developing their nickel and stainless steel industry. And this is a relatively easy step, down that path. For those of us with existing nickel resources, like Sudbury, like Timmins, this will mean, sustained higher than typical prices, for a prolonged period of time, which will be very beneficial to both communities. So, if we need at least 2.5 million more tons, potentially 3.5 million more tons, where is it going to come from? And, again, if you look at by ore source and process, there really are only a handful of opportunities. We're starting with one hand tied behind our back. As I said, all of the growth in supply has come from nickel pig iron and matte. In terms of non-NPI supply, it's actually been shrinking for the most part year in, year out over that time frame. Canada, supply has fallen by more than half where it was before Inco and Falconbridge tried to merge back in 2006. And so, we're just now 4% of global supply. If you look at the specific operations, you can see, the kind of performance that's happened, over that time frame, and again, which is, underpinned that big drop in Canadian nickel supply. So, to date, the old nickel assets have not been a key source of supply. If you look at what was in the cupboard back in the early 2000s when China showed up, we had a significant amount of projects that were sitting in the pipeline. Koniambo and Goro had been around for more than 100 years. A bunch of the other laterites had been around for more than 60, 40 or 50 years at that point in time. And so, in the big nickel boom of the mid 2000s, all of those projects got financed and built. And because you had these very large laterite projects around, there was very little, relatively little exploration into new nickel supply. Inco at one point owned Onça Puma, Barro Alto, Goro, and very early on in their life, had also had some of these other properties. So, Inco at this time was spending lots of money going for copper and zinc in Turkey, and not necessarily looking for new nickel resources, unfortunately. In terms of laterites, the projects that's been developed, the highest grade ones have all been developed. The last high grade discovery was in Burma in the early 1980s. Laterites are relatively easy to discover. If you can get there, you can find them. The resource base today that Tsingshan, DeLong, and some of the other major Chinese companies have turned into, very, very large businesses were effectively drilled off by Inco and some other companies in the 1960s and early 70s. And these companies have benefited from the work that was done, 50 years ago. HPAL outside of Indonesia, we'll still have to see. There's a bit of a question mark. It hasn't had a massively successful track record so far. And we'll see if Sumitomo Metal Mining and some others are able to make it work at a new greenfield project outside of Indonesia. Sulfides, inherently have a lot of significant attractions to them, particularly when you factor in the need for lower carbon nickel. Again, standard mine mill practices, inherently less energy intensive because the sulfur in the material provides a big chunk of the energy that you need to process it. You don't have to build a smelter refinery at the location where you're mining the ore, and so that gives you the opportunity to build scale and put each of the steps in a location that's lower cost. And again, each of that helps create an overall lower carbon footprint. As I said out in the beginning, we've only had 2 in 30 years, Voisey's Bay and now Sakatti. The other big discoveries of the last, 15 years were Nova Bollinger, with now owned by Independence Group, and that's within a few years of the end of its mine life, and Eagle, which again too is also towards the end of its mine life, and it's only 250,000 tons. Remember, in a high growth market, a nickel, something that may seem sizable 20 or 30 years ago can quickly become fairly small. We're consuming more than 3 million tons of nickel per month right now. So each of these, quote, major discoveries were just 1 month of global nickel demand. So relatively small compared to other metals. Voisey's Bay today, in the early 90s seemed like a giant deposit, and it was, because it could supply multiple years worth of demand at that point in time. Today at a couple million tons, it's, at an operating rate, it would only supply 2% of demand. That's, those kinds of deposits just aren't of the scale that are going to plug the gap that we need. I always think of Lynas waiting, and I think this industry and a lot of investors are, quote, waiting for the next high grade discovery. And, as I said, it's been 30 plus years. So just like Lynas waiting for the great pumpkin to come out of the pumpkin patch, people are still hoping that next year will be the year that we'll see this great big high grade discovery suddenly emerge. The other piece that again, as someone who spent a lot of time advancing large low grade deposits, people are fascinated with grade. The thing I would point them to, Mincor has now been acquired by Wyloo. But if you looked at its resource statement, it had 14 deposits with more than 3% nickel. You think about how hard is it to get one nickel intersection, over a mineable width with 3% nickel in it. Then you think about, okay, how hard is it to get a nickel resource that actually averages 3% nickel? And in WA, you've got a bunch of deposits, and these aren't necessarily in remote locations. These might be 200 meters past an existing ramp, and yet they're not in production. Grade is just one variable in an overall value equation. And yes, it's an important variable, but it's just one variable. And there are many, many other variables that are just or more important in terms of being able to deliver real value. Again, if grade was really the only thing that mattered, Victor should have been mined out by now. Victoria should be in production with FNX. Those are both very, very high grade deposits, and they're still sitting undeveloped, again, because the economics of advancing these deep high grade deposits are pretty challenging. Again, big low grade, this is really the new source of nickel. If we need a lot of nickel in the next 5 to 10 years, these are only the only real deposits that can get to market in time and help provide that 500,000 to 1 million ton gap. They're big. You can get us, FPX, Giga, others with more than 2 million tons of nickel, because they tend to be open pit mine mill operations. The beauty of that, if you want to produce more nickel, you buy more trucks, you buy more milling equipment, you produce more nickel. It's no more complicated than that. Again, with the low carbon footprint in places where you have access to low carbon electricity, like Ontario, like Quebec, like British Columbia, you can design a low carbon operation, and with the ability of the tailings to soak up CO2, get to a point that's very, very low carbon. Because of the mineralogy and the lack of iron sulfides, yes, they're low grade, but they can produce very high grade concentrates. Our average nickel concentrate grade in our feasibility study is 34% nickel, which is nearly triple what you would get out of Sudbury and a bunch of other nickel deposits. The good thing is, again, you can find these in not challenging political jurisdictions. In today's world, where we're depending on the Congo for cobalt, Indonesia for nickel, and a lot of other challenging jurisdictions for resources, the ability to find stuff in Canada, Finland, Australia, and other, quote, safe countries is a big plus. And again, we're in a fortunate scenario where we have a lot of infrastructure nearby. The other nice thing with these deposits is the geophysics gives you, we figured this out at the end of Dumont, geophysics gives you about 70 or 80% of the answer. We've confirmed this with what we've done with Crawford. It took me about 30 minutes with 4 drill holes and this geophysics to decide to launch the company and have a firm belief that what we were going after was going to end up bigger than Dumont, and in 4 years was able to prove that out pretty conclusively. Again, what drives that, the geophysics ability to identify, what's necessary, quote, good or bad, is really driven by the amount of serpentinization. As the olivine serpentinizes, it releases the nickel, but it also releases the iron, and the iron becomes magnetite. And so you end up with a very discrete magnetic signature. We've now zeroed in on that. That's why we're able to identify all these targets in the Timmins region. But the quality of the amount of serpentinization drives the quality of the mineralization and drives the recovery, which ultimately drives the overall economics. In terms of how we got here with Crawford, this was north of Timmins was one of those areas where Inco flew massive airborne surveys. Every second drill hole, every mag anomaly, they would drill 1 or 2 holes. In the case of Crawford, you can see 25050 here, and they got 0.25 nickel over 400 meters. So we knew it had contained nickel and oversizable width. It wasn't until it was acquired by Noble, which was out of bankruptcy from Abitibi. 2018, they did the first 4 holes. We started the company in September 2019 and started with hole 5. And again, during that time, because of our experience with Dumont, able to advance this project very, very, very quickly. The great part about it is you've got all the major infrastructure you need in place. We're just up the highway from Crawford. It's 30 minutes from my hotel room. You've got power lines. You've got 60,000 people within an hour's drive. You have a rail line that can be extended into the mine site, and obviously, with the 100 years of mining here, you have a very deep supplier and contractor base that can help you both build and operate these mines. In terms of where we're landed today with Crawford, we're the 2nd largest resource globally, just second to Norilsk. We would be the 3rd largest nickel sulfide operation if we were fully ramped up today, just behind Jinchuan and Norilsk. We are in the lowest decile of the carbon curve, and that again does not include any benefit from the rocks and tailings. And in terms of metrics, feasibility study, $2.5 billion NPV. If you include the carbon capture credit that we expect to get, you're looking at an 18% IRR. At peak production, just under 50,000 tons of nickel, just under 1,000 tons of cobalt, more than 10,000 ounces of PGMs a year. Those 3 are in the nickel concentrate. And some of that nickel pops up along with the iron and chromium that will have a 27-year peak period. The overall mine life for the project is 41 years, and this deposit remains open at depth across the entire strike length. It'll take $1.9 billion initial capital to get going. But again, for this kind of mine life, you can see the cash flows that we expect to generate during that peak period and over the mine life, which are very, very robust. We start at 60,000 tons a day. Again, all we're doing is applying the same open pit mine mill scale you would see at a low grade copper deposit somewhere down in South America or the Southwest US. After a few years, we twin it to 120,000 tons of ore per day. And again, we're just mining $30 rock at a cost of roughly $12 a ton. And that generates the kind of profitability that you see there. You can benchmark these costs against any of the Western Canada porphyry deposits, and end up with costs, in a similar range, adjusting for the fact that most of those operations are 30+ years old. today. In terms of our IPT carbonation, a lot of the ultramafics have looked at passive tailings capture. That's what we looked at with Dumont. That's what we started looking at with Crawford. About 15 months ago, one of my team members thought about just injecting CO2 in the slurry as it was going through the mill. And what we realized is we were able to condense that time down to a very, very short period of time. In the feasibility study, it's designed in that within 6 hours of carbonation, we can fully pick up all of the near-term carbon capture and store 1.5 million tons of CO2 per year. This would allow us to be one of the largest carbon storage facilities in Canada, in addition to producing all of this nickel. From a financial perspective, it's very helpful that these activities we believe will allow us to qualify for the carbon capture and storage credit, which would refund a significant amount of our capital for both phases of the mill construction. We'll be, as I said in the beginning, we'll be the only supplier of chromium in the North American market if we were in production today, about 15% of global supply. When you consider the fact that we will have iron, chromium, and nickel units sitting in a location where you can actually build a melt shop in proximity to our tailings, which could soak up any carbon generated by that melt shop, then the potential to add that melt shop into the Timmins district is a nice bonus, and we're in active discussions with multiple groups to look at making that happen. In terms of timeline going forward, we'll have our second phase of the federal permitting process complete by mid-2024. We'll have our financing package with Scotia and Deutsche Bank, who are leading our equity side, and Cutfield Freeman on the debt package. We expect to get a final go, no-go decision by mid-2025. We'll make a construction decision at that point in time, and we would look to be in first production by the end of 2027 after 30 months of construction. As exciting as Crawford is, as I said at the beginning, we've assembled an entire nickel district using that target geophysical footprint to identify those targets. We have 24 times the footprint of what we've got at Crawford. And remember, Crawford's reserve is just under 4 million tons of nickel. Our overall resource is just under 10 million tons of nickel. Multiply each of those numbers by 24, and you get to some very large numbers. We have 11 targets that are bigger than Crawford. And, as you can see on this map, none of these deposits is very far from existing road, rail, power infrastructure in the Timmins region. Just as one example here, we used the free provincial geophysics to spot 16 holes on Reed. All 16 holes hit the target mineralization that we're looking for. These are doesn't look it on the scale, but these are all 400-meter space holes, and they've delineated a footprint already almost 90% of the size of Crawford. And you can see here from the resource outline, just how helpful the geophysical footprint was. We've already successfully tested our Deloro, Bannockburn, Rayom, Reed, Midlothian, Texmont, Softman, and Man Northwest targets. When you have so much nickel around, if it's remobilized, you've got the opportunity to get some high-grade deposits, and we've got high-grade targets at Bannockburn in our Softman project. Texmont we acquired as a small-scale, low capex potential restart. We'll have a resource and PEA out in the next few months, and if those go well, and we're expecting them to go well, we would be looking to be in production before the end of 2025, a few years before we get to Crawford. And again, you can see some of the drill results here, which are excellent to have. And again, they're very shallow discovery. So we're quite happy with our Texmont pickup. Now, I've talked a lot about the Timmins Nickel District, and some of you might say, no, that's a lot of arm waving, but nickel fundamentally, most of the world's nickel comes from half a dozen regions. Geologically, you need a rip in the Earth's crust to allow a lot of mantle to come up. That doesn't happen typically on a small scale. And so when it does, you end up oftentimes, not always, with multiple deposits. If you look at where, we found supply, Sudbury was around for 20 years before Inco figured out how to separate nickel from copper and unlocked all the value that we've been able to benefit from in Sudbury. And then Tsingshan went into Indonesia, a bunch of land that Inco had walked away from, and basically started building NPI plants and stainless steel mills right on top of these laterite deposits, and has now become the world's largest nickel and stainless steel producer. We think what we have with these big low-grade ultramafics in a region like Timmins, is the foundation for a new source of large-scale, low-grade nickel supply, which is exactly what the North American and European automakers are looking for. In terms of what we've been able to accomplish so far, and we're not the only player in the district. We tried to lock it all up. We didn't get all of it. You can see this is a chart from a Vale conference in 2015, looking at nickel sulfide discoveries over time, and they were pointing to the fact that we'd seen a real shrinking in the size of discoveries relative to the prior generation. You can see where Crawford sits on that map. Even if you account for the recoverability factor, we're still among the 5 largest discoveries that are out there. When you add in Aston Minerals deposit that's just north of us in Southman, and EV Nichols deposit in the Carmen and Lang townships, just to the southeast of Timmins, Timmins is already within 4 years, added nearly 20 million tons of nickel. And so again, we're very excited. We're in very early days, but we really think we are unlocking what will become the premier nickel sulfide district going forward. So again, thanks for your time. Thanks for the opportunity to present to this group, and I look forward to answering any and all questions that you've got about the projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. We do have a couple questions. One of them is there any asbestos associated with the Reeder Crawford deposits in the ultramafics?
Yeah, so basically all ultramafics have a little bit of asbestos in, well, a little bit to a lot. The only other mineral deposit that you find other than a nickel ultramafic is asbestos. Fortunate for us, both Crawford and Reed have very minor amounts of it. We did a massive amount of work at Dumont just to make sure that both the mining, processing, waste storage, tailing storage, that the small amount of asbestos there, we wanted to make sure that it wouldn't cause any issues, and we were able to very clearly demonstrate that that's the case. That carbonation process that effectively cement, that our tailings get cemented up, and during that process, that any fibers that are present are effectively cemented into that matrix.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, and it is in context to sucking up CO2 from the atmosphere. Do you know if the ultramafic host rocks has any brucite or MgOH2? If so, how do you know roughly its abundance?
Yeah, so we do QEM scans across the entire ore body, and through QEM scan we get a sense of what the brucite abundance is. So in addition, in our resource, in addition to the nickel, iron, chrome, PGM, cobalt grades, we also have the percentage brucite in the ore body. And then again, just like you would do a whole series of variability tests to test, what happens when nickel grade or sulfur grade varies in terms of recovery, we did the same sort of test work to understand as brucite grade varies, how does that impact the carbon capture? So we've got a set of models that help explain that based on that brucite content. The brucite is the most reactive mineral, and effectively our IPT carbonation effectively fully utilizes all the brucite content that's there. the full suite of serpentine minerals will carbonate over time. The other ones just do it very, very slowly relative to the brucite.
I think that's all the questions that we have in the chat. Is pyrrhotite in these ultramafics magnetic or non-magnetic? And how does making a magnetic concentrate? And how does that make a magnetic concentrate?
Yeah, so one of the key pieces is what we're looking for is the ultramafic to be fully serpentinized. And that's one of the key ways that we're able to identify these deposits is there's only a certain amount of iron in the olivine before it serpentinizes. So it means when it's fully serpentinized, you only end up with a certain amount of magnetite in the dunite and serpentine. And so that's where we use to identify the deposit. In terms of the processing, it's basically a combination of flotation and magnetic separation. So we do a couple coarse grinding steps. We float off the nickel that's floatable, and after the second grind, we then also do a magnetic separation and pull out the magnetic minerals, which are the magnetite, the chrome spinel, and the aurorite. And that we then clean up to produce our iron chrome magnetite, nickel chrome magnetite concentrate.
More question. Where does one source the high concentration CO2 to inject in the tailing stream?
Yeah, so we've already been approached by a couple very large North American players who, if we step back and said, okay, who are going to be the carbon solution providers to large emitters across North America? There's a handful of names, two of which have already come forward to us and say, again, to remove carbon, capturing it is only one part of the process. You need a place to be able to safely store it and lock it away. And so, unlike Alberta, where you have large sedimentary basins where you're able to inject the CO2, it's not permanently locked away. You've basically just stuck it into a reservoir and hope that it doesn't come back to surface. The nice piece with this mineral-based sequestration is that brucite that somebody asked about. It basically grabs that CO2 molecule and spontaneously converts itself to magnesite, locking away that CO2 in the lattice of the magnesite. And so these guys have already realized that there's a real shortage of carbon storage in central Canada, and so they're pretty keen to work with us going forward. In addition, we could look at building a natural gas power plant that we effectively make a net zero source of power by storing the carbon. We can look at the main natural gas pipeline across Canada, basically follows Highway 11 right along. And again, we could look at making blue hydrogen, effectively green hydrogen, by capturing the CO2 as part of that production process. So there's a number of avenues to be able to take advantage of that carbon storage capacity.
We have a lot of people thanking you for answering all their questions. I also just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to present to us. It was an excellent presentation. And we will be putting this on our YouTube channel in the coming week.
Okay, excellent. Thanks everyone for listening in. Don't ever hesitate to reach out if you've got any questions about nickel in general or about the project. Always very, very glad to help educate people about what we've got. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you.